This is The Stark Truth, hosted by Robert Stark. Brought to you by StarkTruthRadio.com. Robert Stark is an American journalist and political commentator. You can listen to his podcast at www.StarkTruthRadio.com.
Robert Stark here. I am joined here with Brandon Adamson. He's going to be discussing his new book out. It's called Skytrain to Nowhere. It's a photo essay and collection of poetry. Brandon, great having you back on.
Oh, it's great to be back. Thank you.
So I just got back from a long trip to Europe, so I spent quite some time in a lot of airplanes. Or airports, I should say.
Yeah, I bet. Welcome back.
And you obviously spent a lot of time at the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, going around the Skytrain, taking photographs. How long did this take you to make? Not so much the poetry part, but the photography part.
All rather quickly, actually. Within, it took about 3 weeks. 3 weeks to a month, maybe, of going to the airport and riding the Skytrain for maybe 3 or 4 hours each visit. Originally, I had planned to do the book a couple years ago, and my plan was just to go to the airport one day for just like 10 hours or 12 hours or something like that, and just and do the whole book and everything in an entire day. But when I actually got around to doing it, I just discovered that it was going to take me much longer, and that it also took me longer to get photographs that I wanted to get because just circumstances of being there and the weather looking right, and even something as simple as like the windows on the Skytrain being too dirty to take a photograph through at that particular moment.
And you have a lot of great photographs. Most of them are black and white, or with color filters you add on later. Most of them, they're of the Skytrain. You show the airport. You also show the mountains in the distance.
Yeah, I mean, they would all be in color. They're only in black and white because that's a printing issue. Obviously, to do a full color book would cost a fuck ton of money. So that's the only reason that they're in black and white. But the original photos are in color. Yeah,
I mean, obviously it is a lot more expensive, but the black and white has a vintage quality to it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wish that they were in color just because I think it captures much more of the colors of the desert, and it captures a little bit more. But I think that I was happy with the quality of the photographs that did print out in the book. That was something that really concerned me, is that I would get the proof copies of the book, I would look, and the photographs would just be washed out or just seemed totally unusable, because I had never really tried to make a book which included illustrations or photographs. So I just wasn't sure if they were going to look legit or not, because I've seen other people's books that included photographs, and so it just all looked like so janky and amateurish. And so that was a concern of mine. And then as soon as I got the proof, I was like, all right, I'm ready to go ahead with this. So my only other fear, of course, is that it's maybe not like the printing won't be consistent. So if some people got books that the photos didn't come out as well or something, then they would be like, oh, I can't believe he released this or something like that. But that's just kind of a artistic paranoia.
At least you live in Phoenix. There's been cases where I've gone on vacation and taken photographs, and I've maybe been disappointed by the quality of the photographs, and it's a destination that I may not get to visit for quite some time.
Yeah, that's true. I can go back there anytime, but I'm mostly talking just about the print quality, because I actually have thousands of photographs that I took while I was there, and the ones that appear in the book are only about 30 of them that I chose out of a great deal of photos that I took, and they were all ones that I had been going there many times trying to get a specific shot finally. And then also, you may not notice this actually, but in one of the poems, the photograph is actually a photo of I think Space Mountain at Tomorrowland at Disneyland.
Oh yeah,
that I took in 1986, and I just slipped that in there because the book makes references to that. So you have 99%, all the photos are taken from the Skytrain at the airport, and then you have this one photo that I took at Disneyland in 1986, which is the last time that I was there.
Do you actually enjoy airports? Because it seems, I get the impression that you have a passion for airports and the aesthetic and the atmosphere. Most people, they view it as a stressful place. They just want to kind of get through as quick as possible and move on to their travel destination.
Yeah, I actually love the airport. I love the aesthetic of it, the ambiance, and to me, the airport represents like the ultimate potential for like a self-contained city, because it really has everything except living quarters. It has like its own internal transportation system. It has eateries, shops, groceries, even, and just entertainment and museums and things like. I mean, depending upon which airport, the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport is actually a fairly large, gargantuan airport. Maybe other airports are much shittier, but it's.
Would you say about the size of McCarran in Las Vegas?
Yeah, about that. Maybe even, I think Sky Harbor may even be bigger in a sense. I don't know, because I've been to the Vegas airport quite a few times, but I haven't really explored it to the same degree. I think that the Phoenix airport, though, is very large, and not only is it large, but it's really kind of state of the art and world class. I think in terms of airport, it's not some really old like janky rundown airport like you see in so many places. But I love the airport seating, which it looks like it's from the 60s or 70s always, and just the kind of automated nature of it all, and just how organized it is. And I've always liked the airport because it just seems like when you're there that the possibilities are just endless. Like you could go anywhere, and you can all these different places. It's just kind of a really exciting place to be. So that's why I've always loved it. And I think part of it may also be the fact that I did travel a lot when I was a child by myself, and I associate airports with a certain kind of carefree, like 1980s vibe. That it's something that when you go back there, I still feel like I recapture a little bit of that every time I go. There's still some of the if you've ever had something like that, where if you go to a certain place, like it's changed obviously, but you still get kind of a little bit of the same feeling when you go there.
Yeah, I know LAX airport, the Tom Bradley International Terminal. There's a newer part, but the older part has a really '80s aesthetic, but LAX is an airport that I find to be really kind of claustrophobic and kind of stressful to manage. If you've been there.
I have been there. I've been to LAX a few times, and it's the same kind of deal, but maybe it just depends on the certain perspective you're coming with. I mean, maybe if somebody reads this book, then maybe they will go to an airport and look at it a different way. I guess that would be one of my hopes with people who read something like this.
Well,
maybe they would learn to appreciate certain things.
Yeah, it's different because you were going there to take photographs and to kind of you could relax and enjoy yourself. When I was traveling, I was constantly thinking about like trying to get through security as quick as possible, get my ticket, catch my plane. So I was aware of the aesthetics and the situation, but I had all these things in my mind, and I just sort of wanted to get on my plane. Plus, I had to transfer at London Heathrow after a long flight, so if you're going through this kind of stressful experience of travel, you're not going to be able to just relax and enjoy the experience.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a hurry, the airport is a much less fun place to be, especially if you're worried about missing your flight or something like that. But I that's kind of like one of the things is I would always go to the airport like way early just so I could hang out. Obviously, that's not always possible though when you're like trying to make connecting flights and things like that, and dealing with security like in a whole another country. That could be kind of stressful, especially not knowing like what you can bring with you from one country to another, that kind of thing.
I know McCarran in Vegas has a really cool mid-century space age aesthetic. Does Phoenix Sky Harbor have the same aesthetic?
I would say that it has almost more of like an 80s or I wouldn't even say that. I'd say it has more of just a 21st century aesthetic. It's the kind of place where you go there and it actually feels like you're in the 21st century. That's how I would describe it. I mean, there is some maybe older, like maybe 80s or 90s vibe, because much of the newer parts of it were actually built then, but maybe just airports in general just always have that kind of mid-century or 1970s feel, just by their nature of that being such a prominent era in terms of air travel, airlines, and so forth.
I think you even referenced the airport in Leisure Suit Larry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember if I did, but I think that is one of the aesthetic of that airport is really the one that's in Leisure Suit Larry 5, I think, either 4 or 5, I can't remember, but that I remember thinking like, oh, when I was playing the game, I was just like, oh, I would just want to hang out here for most of the game. I didn't even want to do the quests.
And with the Skytrain itself, it does have a kind of retro futuristic aesthetic. Do you have any idea when that was built?
I mean, it's just from a few years ago. I think within the last 10 years. I remember when it was being built for a long time. I don't remember when it actually, when it actually went into action. But definitely within the last, I think, 10 years or so.
So the book is a collection of poems, and in general, I find poetry to be kind of boring, but I enjoy your poetry a lot because every poem you write has a very specific theme.
Well, yeah, thank you. And it's funny that you say that because some people have, have been critical of my style of writing poetry in the past. I think because especially if you have reactionary types, if you have any kind of poetry that seems somewhat freeform or like prose, and it doesn't really have a lot of structure to it, then a lot of them, they think, well, this is just like words rearranged or something like that. I think someone mentioned that in a review of Beatnik Fascism, that some of these are just like prose that's just rearranged on a certain side of the page or something like that. And I'm okay with that kind of criticism, because to me it doesn't really matter what you call it. But my style of writing poetry is very freeform, almost like a run-on sentence, but I actually do use structure and rhyming sometimes, but I use it in places of the poem where I want to emphasize the theme or a certain message. Like, so I use structure strategically within poems to emphasize certain parts that I think are crucial to the meaning of the poem.
You told me that the book was inspired by Keith Gunderson's A Continual Interest in the Sun and the Sea. I have not read that, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was just in some little used bookstore called Bard's Books, and I used to go in these bookstores and just try to find something totally random to buy that looked interesting, either just some old 70s book or something, just anything that seemed intriguing. So I found this book by Keith Gunderson called A Continual Interest in the Sun and Sea. And it was really just all about, it was just him, his poems about, like, I guess he was really heavily into, like, boating out on the ocean and just kind of living about the sea for a few years. And they were all just poems about his appreciation for the ocean and for water and sea creatures and things like that. And it was all kind of based on his experience. But the whole theme of it was that, and it kind of got me to thinking, like, oh, well, what is it that I am passionate about that maybe I could do, like, an entire poetry book that's themed about my interest in a certain thing. And to me, like, something like the Skytrain or the airport or being at the mall would be something I would write a book of poetry, because that to me is like my interest in nature.
So
would be like the equivalent.
You're actually not that interested in nature that much.
Well, I am. I consider everything to be part of nature. I don't really think anything can exist outside of nature, because everything, even things that man does, like they're a product of his brain, which is a biological part of the organism. So anything really that humans think up is really a part of nature. It's not anything separate, despite what people think, unless you're one of those people who thinks that, like, maybe the brain or something, humans are, like, not of biological origin or something. That would be, if you really think about it, it's really kind of an extreme position to think that, like, the things that humans don't think up, things that humans create or invent or think up, like, are somehow not part of nature.
I get what you're saying, but there's a totally different aura if you're hiking through the mountains as opposed to being in a shopping mall. There are two completely different environments.
Well, someone could perceive them to be different, but my point is that the way that someone feels when they're doing that is the equivalent of how I feel when I'm doing these other things. So even though it's different, like the awe that someone feels when they're hiking a mountain or looking at some little lizards or something on a leaf out in the jungle, is like the same equivalent awe that I feel when I'm doing this sort of thing. That's all I'm saying. But getting back to Keith Gunderson's book, because this is important, and that is that liked his book so much that I wrote a brief review of it, and I actually looked the guy up to see if he was still alive, and I found out that he was like a professor at University of Minnesota or something. He was like in his late 70s, and so I actually sent him an email, and I was like, hey, I found your book, and I really liked it, and I did a write-up of it here. And he emailed me back, and he was so excited. He was like, it makes me so happy to receive these kinds of emails from people. And he's like, I'm going to send you a copy of the book that has the second part of it, which is Inland Missing the Sea. Because later he did a re-release which included a continual interest in the sun and sea and Inland Missing the Sea. And he's like, I'm going to send you that, which has both of them. And, and then he never sent it. But, I mean, he was really old, so I was like, oh, well, he must have forgot. But then I checked a year or two later, and he had died, like a couple of years after that. So that was my story of Keith Gunderson's A Continual Interest in the Sun and Sea. And he also wrote another book, and this is kind of an odd coincidence, which is he wrote another book which was kind of like an early 1970s philosophical book on AI called Mentality and Machines, which I haven't been able to get a hold of, and I really want to read. But apparently he kind of makes some kind of argument about the difficulty of, or maybe even the impossibility of, like, machines ever becoming self-aware. So I've really wanted to read it because I think for a book like that in the early 1970s that it's probably kind of ahead of its time. So
you told me that there's very little offensive material in the book compared to your previous works like Beatnik Fascism. I think there's like one sort of a racial reference in the book.
I mean, there's a couple, but they're very subtle, and they're almost kind of expressed reluctantly, in the sense that I kind of lament, I really don't want to comment on this because, I want to make this experience all about like a meditative experience of riding the Skytrain and keeping it kind of like positive and kind of surreal. And the last thing I want to do, it's very tempting when you write a book like this, because you can imagine if you're on any kind of public transit and you're going to be writing about the experience, like, I mean, one of the main temptations is going to be to write about obnoxious or irritating passengers, right? That's going to be like one of the first things. So I made a conscious decision to not make that a prominent focus of the book, and instead to try my best to ignore it. And there were just a couple instances when I found that it kind of that it related to it enough, and that it was worth mentioning, But as you could see that, like, out of all, it's very few of it is related to that, and it's almost kind of by coincidence, because there's another poem where I mention that there's this teenage girls, like a basketball team or volleyball team or something, that's like on the Skytrain while I'm on there, like a whole team of them, and they're not making as much noise as like these, whole Skytrain filled with teenage girls, and they're not even making as much noise as this one Somali lady that's like yapping on her cell phone, hooting and hollering. But so you could read that and think, and you could read into that a racial connotation, but I don't mention in the poem that a bunch of the girls on the basketball team were black and non-white. So it wasn't like even that way you could read that into a racial connotation. But I didn't even mention the fact that a bunch of the girls on the sports team weren't even white, so it's kind of like a reader may not pick up on that.
And the thing is, this is a book that you could sell to art house bookstores. Beatnik Fascism is probably too controversial for art house bookstore.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I actually did sell copies of Beatnik Fascism to places like that. I mean, they actually had it in some like zine libraries and things like that. It doesn't. It actually was. I think because Beatnik Fascism was so outlandish that it was like I was able to get away with certain things because really it was only like semi-serious, you know. So I mean, someone could look at it and be like, you know, this is ridiculous, and they would just accept it as that. But with Skytrain to Nowhere, one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to market and reach people that I would like or find interesting, as opposed to like attracting political people, because one thing that I often get tired of when you write about any kind of politics is just the type of people that you attract. And I mean, obviously you can relate to this from doing the show, right? It's just that like you attract so many like lunatic, quote, like supposed fans that it's I find that it's worth it for me to make something that people can connect with on a different level. And you know, I've had people that have already bought this book that would have never that would have probably shunned me otherwise if they've read other things that I've written, but because like you know, they were able to relate to the material on this level, that they were okay with it. And that's I want to attract people, the kind of people that I would like and have common interests with and get along with. And unfortunately, that's not always people that you may agree with on political issues. Like, it just really isn't. And and another thing I've discovered, and perhaps you have too, is that you attract a lot of fans writing about politics that really don't they don't have any idea that like what your political views are, and they don't even understand that like you don't even agree with them. Like that's I don't know, that's happened to me so many times when like someone would email me or message me or start following me like, oh yeah, I'm a big fan of your stuff or whatever, and then I would look at their profile or something and what they write, and I'd be like, this person is like, they believe like the opposite of what they do. Like, I must be doing something completely wrong if this person thinks that like we're on the same page.
Are you
so
talking
part of that is kind
about the left, or about the kind of 1488 types in the far right?
Well, just all different kinds of people. Yeah, I mean, in fact, I think I had someone who was like, you know, he was pointing me towards like some candidate or something, and this guy was like some kind of like a conservative, like Democrat, like religious, like, and you know, he was like real hardcore, like pro-life or something, and like that sent to me as an example of like something that I would like, which is someone who's like maybe like a conservative Democrat or something. And I'm thinking like, you know, obviously like this person doesn't know anything about me if they think that like, yeah, I'm obviously like pro-choice. Like, I think like abortion should be encouraged. Like, you know, I'm not like, so it's just kind of like, you know, I think that like, you know, if 75% of humanity would just like die off, like that would probably be good. Like, and so I had this idea that like, so, but that happens to me all the time, where someone will think something like that, or if you say it's kind of, or if I post something on Twitter that has any kind of racial like connotations, then like I'll get like 10 followers, but they'll be these like weird like hyper trad guys, and you know, like Julia Savola fans or something, and it's kind of like, well, if you understood anything I've ever said or written at all, you would know that, like, we're not like, you would never follow me in a million years.
Well, the
like,
thing
except for the few people that like that just understand that, and they just like find my stuff interesting enough that they're willing to like tolerate all of it.
The thing is our political and cultural views are so niche, and on one hand, it feels kind of cool to be part of this small elitist subgroup and kind of look down on everyone else, but it's also kind of frustrating not to have a lot of people you can connect with.
Yeah, I mean, it sucks, not to have like a horde that you can like wield at your command, like some of these people, where they just have. I mean, it would be so easy too, and I'm sure you feel this way, that if you just kind of, if you just joined one of these teams and just embrace all their, like, you would be so much more popular, or you would have a huge tribe, and it's just kind of like, I think that is kind of frustrating because, we're just not built like that. I'm just not.
So back to the book and the Skytrain. So the Skytrain doesn't really go anywhere outside the airport. Obviously, it's for connecting the airline terminals. But in your book, you actually imagine and you envision potential destinations. I think one of them is directly to Las Vegas, but also fantasy destinations, and you kind of explore the possible ways in which that kind of technology could be used. So the Skytrain is a vehicle for escapism.
Yeah, it is, and I think that most people, when they ride something like this, they're just like, no, whatever, and nice view on the way to where I parked my car, and they're thinking about like where they parked their car, because the Skytrain doesn't really go anywhere. That's one of the reasons it's called Skytrain to Nowhere, is that it just takes you around the airport to different terminals and to the parking facilities, and I think like the light rail station. So it doesn't even really go anywhere. But when I wrote it, I thought of like all of the potential places that it really could go, and that what an amazing system of transportation this is. And as I ride it through the desert, I'm thinking like, oh, it would be really great to if this just took you all the way to Las Vegas, and you could just get on this after work and just ride it to Las Vegas. And I purposely made the poem about riding the Skytrain to Las Vegas. I purposely made it like the most boring and like mundane like trip to Las Vegas. Like someone would read it and think like, God, this is like the most boring trip to Las Vegas ever.
Is this
because
the
it's
one
basically like
about treadmill to Neonopolis, which is named after that?
No, it's not. It's not that one. I believe it's called the alternate pay line, and it's where like you ride the Skytrain to Vegas and like have a drink and like play like $50 worth of slots and walk around and then like do a couple things, and then like you come home. And like the point of it being such a boring trip is to envision a society where you could just do that, right? Like you could just ride the Skytrain to Las Vegas after work and have dinner and then come home, like to Phoenix or somewhere else. And I think that was really the what I was really getting at there. So if someone reads that, they're going to be like, God, like, this sounds like the most boring trip to Vegas ever. But like it's supposed to be, because it's supposed to be making going to Vegas as simple as like walking to 7-Eleven or something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Maybe in the future when we have like Elon Musk's Hyperloop or some form of really fast high-speed rail, we'll be able to get to these travel destinations really quickly. But part of what makes them special is the long journey, the difficulty in getting there. If you can just go there like in an afternoon, they kind of lose. It's possible that those places could lose their sense of escapism, and they could just become more mundane.
Right. It becomes less of like this epic, memorable trip, right? Like, your trip to Europe that you went to, you haven't been there in like 25 or 30 years, and you go there for a couple weeks. Like, if it was just like a 1 hour train ride to get there, obviously like the stuff you're going to do there is going to be like, is going to be way less epic.
So, do you plan on expanding the Skytrain to Vapor Island and the Erotic Emporium?
Well, I mean, that's kind of implied. I will say though that the poem "Treadmill to Neonopolis" is kind of a nod to Vapor Island a little bit, only in a kind of almost in a kind of inside way, because when obviously you and I have talked about Neonopolis, the kind of the place in Las Vegas.
I don't think we actually went there in Las Vegas, but I discovered it.
No, we discovered it like after it.
Yeah,
and then
and I think it kind of looks. I mean, it was actually built in 2002, but the aesthetic of it is almost kind of like a vaporwave.
Or just like an 80s kind of 80s neon. I mean, neon is really heavily associated with 80s, especially like whatever that place is, like a kind of mini mall or something like that. But so in that poem, I not only do I reference that as kind of a potential for a name of a city that's like that, but it's kind of also a reference to the imagery from the NES game 3D World Runner, which is kind of relates to the poem in the sense that as you kind of move through these like these 80s games like 3D World Runner or Rad Racer or something, you see like the backdrop of this city that you're moving towards, but you don't ever really get to it.
Oh, is that the one that you used for Ashley Messinger's article review of Roger Blackstone in Journey to Vapor Island?
Yeah, exactly. Like the I forget. I used that image for like a fake. I used the image from one of the cities of 3D World Runners for like a fake cover of a book by Roger Blackstone that I used as the image. I can't remember what it was called. Like something like the Aristocratic City by Roger Blackstone.
Oh, right.
And then the image that I used from it was from one of the backdrops in the NES game 3D World Runner. So that is how that one poem relates to Journey to Vapor Island. That's kind of really the only casual reference to it.
There's also mythological references in the book to Atlantis. And I don't think I explicitly, I don't know, maybe I do actually, I do, but there's also a reference to Atlantis in Vapor Island, where Vapor Island is actually built over the lost city of Atlantis, and Roger Blackstone is like excavating Atlantis. Do you remember that part?
I do remember that, and that's actually, that's awesome. I've always been like fascinated by the myth of Atlantis, because I think it in some of the mythological references in the book are kind of a little bit contrarian. They take a contrarian take because like I really like the concept of Atlantis, but usually when the Atlantis like myth is portrayed, it's portrayed as like this was like a technologically innovative place that eventually fell victim to kind of its own technological inventions, and it was ultimately like destroyed by a volcano or something like that, and that it kind of like got too that somehow that this technological advancement was bad. And I've always thought, like, no, Atlantis was awesome. Like, and whenever I watch like old movies about Atlantis, like Atlantis: The Lost Continent with John Dahl, I remember watching it thinking like, that the Atlanteans were paranoid about these other people, and I was thinking like, I was like, yeah, like, these other people are the Atlanteans need to, they need to protect themselves, and they need to, they've got this great society, and I'd actually take their side, even though they were portrayed as these kind of villains. And what brought this to mind is because there is I discovered a publication called The New Atlantis, and I thought like, oh, like this sounds awesome, like I should totally try to write for these guys or something, or send them some stuff. And then I discovered that like the publication is called The New Atlantis because it's actually like kind of anti-transhumanism and anti-technology, and that it's kind of like we have to like be careful the technological stuff that we get into to avoid becoming a new Atlantis or something like that. So, and it's actually just kind of this weird crypto trad publication. And I remember thinking like, oh, like what a disappointment. Like they're actually the publication is kind of almost specifically dedicated to fighting things like technological life extension and transhumanism and different kinds of technological paths and things like that. So it's really kind of like disappointing. So that's one of the reasons for references to Atlantis and to a lot of my the fascination with Atlantis is kind of somewhat contrarian, I think, because I don't really read the myth the same way. Same thing with the reference to Icarus. Like I make a reference to the myth of Icarus, where I say like that Icarus did nothing wrong. Where it's kind of like because he made these like these wings, and then he flew too close to the sun, and that was like kind of his punishment for trying to become godlike, or trying to become like trying to push too hard or something like that. And I just remember thinking like, well, humanity should always be willing to push the limits of like what it can achieve. Like even if he ended up dying, like the idea that like we should just like not try to become more advanced and to become more knowledgeable and things like that. That's somehow like getting too big for ourselves, or that there's the gods are going to frown on that or something like that. That's always seemed to me to be kind of just not my way of thinking.
So you talk about the airport as a blueprint for self-contained cities, and you've also made the same case about shopping malls, and I think we've even talked about that with Las Vegas casinos, kind of the whole concept of an arcology, where you basically have an entire city in one structure. And you were saying in an airport you have restaurants, grocery stores, you have the transit. So can you elaborate on that in more detail?
Yeah, so when you have the Skytrain taking you to various terminals, like I kind of picture it as something like Logan's Run, where it's taking you to different like sectors and quadrants in the city. So instead of just taking you to like the parking garage and Terminal 2 and Terminal 3, it could be taking you to to recreation and to like the housing sector, and to to all of these different areas, right? And you would have like Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. Some of these other airports are really almost the size of like a small city.
Yeah,
really.
I'm
Like
sure a lot of these airports have maybe 20,000 people in them at one time.
Yeah, they do. And if you just picture it like something like that on an island or in something like that, that it would be it could function as its own self-contained city. It almost has everything that you would need. You could almost like just convert the airport into a living space. And I think that, and this is something that I kind of mentioned briefly in the book, that an airport, that one of the challenges of making an airport into a city or a mall or something like that is how do you do it if it's not an airport anymore, right? Because you don't have any reason for all of these people to be coming and going through it. Like, part of what gives it its vitality is all of this, all of the action that's going on there. If it's just the self-contained city, like why would anyone go there? And it's because, and I think that's one of the messages that the book explores, is that we have to find in ourselves like the ability to keep that kind of vitality, to always keep moving and doing things, even if you're not physically moving through like an airport or something like that. Like we have to find in ourselves like a way to continually replace our own vitality and find like reasons to keep moving, even if you're not necessarily traveling anywhere.
So you touched upon this, and you have this photograph of Disneyland you took in 1986, but your fascination with Skytrains and monorails originates from your trips to Disneyland and Disney World in the 1980s.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, part of that is because I was a small child, and also because I've never been back. Like, that was the last time I'd been to Disneyland in 1986, and Disney World was in 1984 or 85. So I have not been to either of those since. When we went to Florida in 1990, we ended up going to Busch Gardens instead. So I think that my first time like riding the monorail and the People Mover and these things especially like at Disneyland, because that trip is much more memorable for me. I think that when I go to places like these, it makes me think that, like, when I'm there, it's like, wow, this is really fun. Like, why aren't actual cities just like this? Why does someone have to come to like this kind of place to experience this? Like, why isn't just your city have this stuff?
Well, I think in some ways,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think Disneyland actually did play a role in influencing the whole new urbanist movement, because Disneyland pretty much does function as a self-contained city in a sense that most of it is pretty much within walking distance, and you also have the monorail, but you also have the train that goes around it. So that's also, theme parks are also kind of self-contained cities.
Yeah, exactly. So if you go to a place like that, then most people would just be like, oh, you know, having fun at Disneyland or something. But I'm thinking, like, when I leave, I'm thinking, like, why don't people just make cities that are like this? Like, why do you have to come here just for like this this kind of amusement park or whatever, like novelty? Like, why don't you
exactly, because
like
you go to the Las Vegas Strip, and then you go to Disneyland in Orange County, and those are amazing places, but then you go outside there, and then basically most of Las Vegas and Orange County is just these really crappy subdivisions. So people make these amazing places as entertainment destinations, but people are, when it comes to actually,
you go there for like one day out of the year.
Yeah, when it comes to actually planning cities, people just don't. There's no innovation or grand visions whatsoever.
Yeah, and this actually brings to mind something else, and it's one thing I feel the same way about Halloween, because you have, and this is kind of why I've always kind of like resented people that are really into Halloween, is because it's like they take one day out of the year to be really imaginative and dress exotically and all these like creative garb and whatnot, and it's like, but the rest of the year there's these total just like boilerplate like normal unimaginative people, and it's like why would, what's preventing you from like dressing interesting like all the time, you know, and experimenting with like with what you wear? It's like, well, you pick like one day of the year to like put some effort into like and some imagination into what you're gonna wear, and be willing to step outside the boundaries of like this total like normal boring bullshit. So on Halloween you pick one day of the year to be interesting, like so that's something that's always kind of bugged me about Halloween, and like one reason I don't really ever like celebrate or like dress up for Halloween is just because like it's just not, I don't feel like I need that one day for an outlet to, you know, considering that like I'm down to do like weird stuff all the time. So
and yeah, I totally agree. And with Disneyland, I was last there in 2004 for my high school grad night. But I know with Tomorrowland and Disneyland, it used to have this really cool mid-century space age aesthetic, and they remodeled it in the late 90s, and now it's basically garbage.
Yeah, and that's another reason why I haven't gone back, is because my favorite ride was the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or the Submarine Voyage ride, whatever you call that.
Submarine, I think, is still there, but they changed it.
Well, they changed the theme, I think, to like Finding Nemo or something like that.
Right,
but
yeah.
it was, but like the old one, and you can watch footage of it on YouTube in the 80s. Like I just was like, that was just the most memorable ride for me. It was just incredible, and it's funny because that's even. There's even a part of the ride where they would mention, and like, oh, could these ruins be the lost city of Atlantis? And like, and there were like these animatronic mermaids or something that were in the water, and I remember I referenced that in the book, and I think that that's one of the struggles too, is that you have a nostalgia for the stuff in it, but you can't go back to it because it's not that you can't just go back there because all of that stuff is gone.
And that's the whole theme of retrofuturism. Retrofuturism is something that it didn't exist, it does not exist, so it's sort of like what could have been. So I view retrofuturism as this alternative universe or alternative timeline, and it's something that doesn't exist, but maybe we should strive to create it.
Right, because you're not strictly just going back to a certain time period. You're kind of going back to a time period and then wanting to veer off into a different timeline. So it's not the same as just like the straight up traditionalism that's just kind of like they want to go back to certain aesthetics and social norms and just kind of and get back to that. It's more like, oh, here are these possibilities that like that they imagined, but like they didn't pursue. So we want to pursue them, and that's kind of how I view retrofuturism too. And it also, I think it creates a kind of struggle with retrofuturism, and this gets into more of the actual theme of the book, and that is that the kind of the retrofuturist dilemma is that they're inspired by nostalgia and by these memories of certain things and possibilities and childhood memories and things like that. But at the same time, you struggle with internally, like, you know that you've always got to keep moving and not get hung up on this stuff. But at the same time, you have to choose, like, kind of what you want to take with you. Like, it's like if you're going on a journey and you have like a backpack, like you don't want to have too much of the past with it, but like you're obviously inspired by that stuff, and you have to be willing to accept that you are, and you can't just be like, oh, I'm going to leave all the past behind. Like, it's kind of a struggle to decide like what's important enough to take with you.
Is there an importance of always staying on the move in life and never getting too comfortable, and how that relates to the Skytrain?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think that it's the very first poem is just like the secret of the Skytrain is that it never stops moving for too long. I think that you've always got to have something that you're working on, or some dream that you're working towards, that you always got to keep moving and keep like wanting to experience new things. And I kind of look at that as like a metaphor for like time dilation, right? Whereas like if you the faster you move, then like the slower that time moves for you in relation to other people. So
because
really,
yeah, like one example of that.
Do you understand?
I totally understand that. Like one example of that is if you go on a vacation or trip, like 1 week feels like a really long time span because you're doing so many different things, seeing new sights. But if you have the same routine for a couple years, it can feel like that time is condensed and it's basically wasted time because there's no new experiences, and 1 year can feel like 1 week in your long-term memory.
Yeah, and so it's kind of a metaphor. Even though with time dilation, if you fly around the world or something, in reality, it's like it's really like 1/100th of a second or something, that time has gone slower for you or something. But I think it's as like a metaphor for like if you keep moving, it's kind of like your life has always got to keep finding purpose and keep doing things and experiencing things, and that's how people stay young and how people stay fresh, right? Is like if you're it's like a river. If a river is not like constantly flowing, then the water gets all gross and like stagnant and disgusting. I think that like for years and years the Milwaukee River was like this like disgustingly polluted thing, and then eventually they figured out that they like had to make the water like just flow, and then suddenly it was like clean, like after they couldn't do anything to get rid of the pollution, and it was just this totally grimy, like disgusting, chemically infested, gross river. And it's kind of the same kind of mindset as if you keep moving, it's like stay active. That's like it's going to keep your blood moving and things like that and rejuvenate you. It's really just a metaphor for that, and that's kind of like how it relates to the Skytrain, is that it doesn't stay in one place. It comes every 2 minutes. It comes, it's gone. You're on it. You're off, and like that's kind of that's the secret of the Skytrain.
So we're getting at the end of the show. In case people are interested in buying the book, it's available on Lulu.
And Amazon.
And before I wrap things up, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, not really, but you should snag a copy of it, and and if you're ever in Phoenix, or the next time that you go to the airport or ride a Skytrain, my hope is that you'll read this book and you'll experience it a different way.
Brandon Adamson, it's been an excellent show. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks again, Robert.